Hello, this is Asa Simpson from Mr. Work's AP English language class. This is going to be my reading journal conference for the Man Who Is Thursday. Um, my first point that I made out was, as usual, right at the beginning. I noticed right away, and I noticed that I said that I asked myself, like, how will poetry and philosophy play into the book's general themes? And I noticed right away from inferring about inferring that philosophy had something to do with the theme of the book. Because it was kind of reference to Parian here as I was thinking about it, and as Parian says, that there is a right and wrong way to interpret poetry, which is ironic because that is kind of like the opposite of how like generally philosophy works. Philosophy is always like argued upon and everything. As I state here, I say, it's this is like kind of the opposite of how philosophy works, as philosophy is constantly argued, and a lot of this book is kind of like arguing about which way is right and which way is like wrong in terms of philosophy, in terms of whether the argument of anarchy versus chaos. And in the end, I think that one of the main themes of the book, which I'll be talking about later, is kind of how that the only true philosophy is order, because the only way for even anarchy to work is for order to be established. So for the second point I made, I just said that Chesterton writes, and again referencing Parian, I was constantly thinking of Parian as I noticed that Chesterton kind of writes and describes the what's going on kind of like a poet, almost like his writing is somewhat similar to poetry. At least that's the kind of vibe I got out of it. And I noticed that, and I assume that he does this to foster an ease of use of details, which allow for vivid description, similar to poetry, as like poets don't really just there isn't they don't just state what they mean. It's kind of like a process of getting to what they mean, which is kind of I thought how Brian would or kind of how I thought Chesterton writes in his book. So I pointed that out there under the second point here. So the next thing I said was I again, similar to last time, I predicted the story would be about anarchy versus chaos. But I was almost tricked. I guess you could say like tricked by Chesterton, as I think he kind of asserts in the beginning that this is going to be a story arguing, philosophy between lawlessness and or chaos and chaos and order. But in the end, it seems to be that like uh, Chesterton kind of like fools the reader into thinking that it's going to be about about arguing philosophy, uh, whereas by the end of the book we kind of realize that there is no true anarchist. All the leadership of the anarchists are all policemen anyway. So it's kind of ironic how Chesterton does that with his writing, and he kind of like I think this was intentional. He kind of like lures the reader into like almost like a false sense of security, as the reader would assume that that Chesterton is saying this is going to be that this is about order and chaos. So the next thing I pointed out is that Chesterton states that poetry and anarchists poets are Chesterton states through the dialogue of Gregory that poets are anarchists by their very nature. And I just said that Prine would disagree with this, as he always says that poets are essentially trying to convey their meaning, and that there's a right and wrong way, which means that, it's saying that, like, many argue that it's up to interpretation, which would be more of like an anarchistic view. Everyone, it's up to what a poet writes is up to the reader to interpret, and that's how they write it. But what Prion says is, Prion tells us that there is a right way and wrong way to think about poetry. Essentially, that poetry is, like, the writer has an intention of what they want poetry to be when they write their poetry, and not that it's, they're sort of anarchistic with their views as they write poetry. And I stated that for quickly there. I just said that pointed out how Prion would disagree with one of Chesterton's perhaps views on the issue of poetry. Then the next point I said, I just said that I noticed that I made a lot of claims. I have several claims. One example of this is I just said, you see right here, number 19, I said, I asked, like, how serious is Gregory really about this issue? And I kind of, like, made a claim that, it wasn't necessarily a claim, but I made, like, an inference about the future. And I noticed that I did a lot of, like, I started that with the last book with the Professor and the Madman, after I learned that I didn't make a whole lot of claims at the beginning of the book that would kind of, like, carry me through my thinking. So I did that a lot in this book as well, intentionally, to make sure I'm continuing that and then getting some things right, so it can kind of train my thinking. So the next thing I said was, I noticed that at some point Syme says that Syme, through one of his pieces of dialogue, which is somewhat poetic, like I said, Chesterton writes very poetically, and as I say here, it just says Syme says that through his poetry that sometimes, which is number 13 here, it's got a star, that he points out that most of the times writers or poets mean, or that people mean more than they say, more than they mean, just by meaning it. So, like, instead of them saying directly what they mean, they kind of, like, people can understand what they mean just because they're so passionate about it already, So, and I think this directly, I made a direct connection between this and poetry, as from what I know and from what I've learned from Prion, is that poets, by their very nature, that is what poets do. Poets write less than they mean, and they hope that expressing what they mean without explicitly writing it, exactly what they mean, like a writer of a book may do, or writers of books do that as well. But somebody who's just stating what they mean or arguing for what they mean, they write kind of like a either like a comparison, or whatever their piece of poetry is, that kind of says less than they mean, but they kind of hope that by writing what they write, that with their writing, they will deliver their message through their poetry, rather in a more convincing way, or in a more profound and a more understandable way than they would have been able to if they simply argued for their point. So yeah, that's something I mentioned about that. So I see what else. So I pointed out that on 3 occasions here, I tried to connect, and I kept looking for symbols and objects, or places to mean more than they really meant in the book, and it turned out that they weren't really symbols. And here I was kind of attempting to use is this one difference I guess I could say is this through this read through is I noticed that I constantly was trying to think about the three pillar essays as I was reading through, because in the past I had really only I either hadn't thought about it or I just thought about it through the read through of my notes. I had thought about the pillars. This time as I was reading I was attempting to think about the three pillars. So I noticed that I pointed out many symbols and attempted to convey meaning to them using Frost to attempt to find out what the author was trying to convey through the story, and from like as Chesterton took us through place to place, and I pointed that out. That's the second point, or yeah, no, that's the first point here on the top. So I just pointed out that I noted on several occasions that I used symbols as I was going through the book to help better my understanding as I was reading through, which I think could help me in the future more than now. It didn't pan out in this circumstance, but I think that in the future I will be able to use this to some success. So for the next point, I noticed that after reading after reading through my notes again, I had realized that everyone after finishing the book, I noticed that everyone in the book was kind of pretending to some extent, like all the police officers that were all the leadership of they made up the leadership of the anarchists were all pretending they were all police officers, which is kind of ironic in its own right, but it's kind of like shows how everyone was pretending essentially. And I noticed that the only one who couldn't pretend really was and to any success was sorry, I'm blanking on the name. Was Gregory, because he attempted to kind of like smooth things over and make it seem like this idea of anarchy was super loose for the officer once he figured out that Syme was a policeman. So I thought that was kind of a neat thing to point out. And I also noticed about myself that, again, like it's... I noticed that I kind of like notice a lot of irony as I go through the book, especially with this book. I'm not sure if it's particularly ironic or if I just noticed more this time, but that's just something I noticed about myself. So then the next idea is I noticed somewhat of a theme, and I recognize here in my note that there is no really that maybe perhaps one of the themes of the book is that there is no real true anarchy. I pointed out right here. This is point 30. It's starred. I have my finger on it. So, and I noticed through that kind of, the one I think theme of the book is that there is no real true anarchy. That like that even, and as I mentioned earlier, even through chaos, even through anarchy, there needs to be order. In order for anarchy to truly work, there needs to be order. Otherwise, anarchy will be simply put down by order. So there needs to be order throughout anarchy in order for it to truly be successful and to accomplish anything. So through that, I kind of noticed that I think and through the fact that that truly all the officers turned out to be policemen, all the leadership of the anarchists turned out to be policemen. I noticed that I think one of the themes that Chesterton is, and one of Chesterton's main points here is that there is no true anarchy. So for the next point, I just noticed that throughout my notes here, I took in every detail and I kind of like put myself into this situation as I didn't know what was going to happen next. I knew like the beginning of the exposition had ended and I knew the action was going to start happening. But so here I noticed that, as I point out, I kind of took in every detail, which is, again, this is me thinking about Nabokov especially as I was reading. This is the final point here. is just I took in every detail into consideration in order to like formulate my thoughts about the topic and to kind of and to understand and to finally make the claim which I made in my point there. So so I just kind of noticed that I kind of especially took Nabokov into consideration there, and Nabokov I noticed was it's kind of a given throughout this whole book because the way that Chesterton kind of like describes things is very poetic and such. So it's easy. I think it fosters a way of easily taking all details into consideration and kind of like creating the picture of what's going on through the details, especially. So that's something I tried to dive into with that as well, and I pointed out that I did that in particular there. So my final thing is, or I guess one more thing is that I noticed that the metaphor of how all anarchists have been secretly led by police this whole time. I noticed that through the metaphor of how the policeman, the order essentially, is leading the anarchists and is kind of like, so I kind of noticed that I guess something that Chesterton could be saying is that all anarchists are secretly or anarchy in general needs to be led through order again. So like in order for anarchy to be successful, order needs to be present in the anarchy. So I kind of pointed that out that essentially something that a loose theme that Chesterton could be saying is that anarchy is order. Like throughout anarchy, it's always anarchy is order. Even though it attempts to strike down and take away order, anarchy truly is order through itself. So then finally, I just noticed that my final point that I wrote down here is I just noticed that as I kind of mentioned my first time for the first reading journal conference is that I again learned a lot more about this book through going back over my notes and through doing this video than I ever learned while reading the book and while going through, especially with this because it's kind of weird, like there isn't really the ending is kind of sad. It doesn't really have like a huge climax. The book is projected to be something that it's not really. So I was kind of almost. It seems like I was almost lost at the beginning, but then that taught me on the way back. This maybe have been like purposeful misdirection, and that's just one example of me realizing something on the read through rather than the first read. So yeah, that's just something I noticed, and so I just find that I keep learning more and more every time I read through my read through, and like even though I've done read throughs in the past, it still shines through now. So I wonder if that's going to continue or if that will stop. So anyway, that's been my reading journal conference. I'm just going to flip through some of my pages just to show you my work that I've done. So here, I would like to point out that my first two, this is just my notes in general. But yeah, so here are my notes. And for the first two pages, I forgot to, I just wrote notes on my left and right hand pages on accident. So then I did a full page so I complemented that with a full page of analysis for the next two pages. So these first two pages have been notes. And then these next two pages will be, so this is all analysis and the next one will be, so then this is also just all analysis. And then I have some more notes here. And then, so some analysis here, just a quick analysis of some points from the previous page. And my notes again, some more notes again. And admittedly, this has been a bit disorganized. I will definitely say that for sure. My notes this time have been a bit disorganized. so I apologize for that. It's just a bit of my bad writing. I accidentally skipped some pages. I had very little written on one page because I thought that I was done early with that page. So here's some more analysis points, and then so here's finally my final analysis page, and yeah, so that's all I have for now. Thank you for listening to my journal conference. I certainly learned a lot about myself through this, so yeah. Anyway, see you tomorrow.